Good morning. Happy New Year and welcome everyone to our 2024 forestry webinar series. I'm Lane Mosier. I'm a forester with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, working alongside Eli Sagor, who won't be able to join us today. But instead, we have Emily Dombeck with our ULM Extension team helping us out this morning. We're joined today by Chrissy Shaw and Ethan Reagan. Chrissy Shaw is the Senior Forestry Manager for the Family Forest Carbon Program with the American Forest Foundation. We do have just a couple announcements here before I throw to Chrissy. Our webinars going forward will be completely free. And we encourage folks to pass this around to other foresters in your office too. Even if they couldn't join us today, we'd love to have folks here. And again, going forward, they will be free. You'll still get the continuing ed credit for the live viewing. We'll have a link to view that at the end. But just wanted to stress that there's also, you should have seen when you registered an option to add these to your calendar. So we'll still be sending week out reminders for the webinars, just so it's on folks' radars with everything going on. But we won't be sending out the morning of or the day prior webinar reminders, because there is that option to put it on your Google Calendar, your Yahoo Calendar, your all the calendars that folks use. I think Outlook as well. And I think with that, we'll just throw it to Chrissy and get rolling here. Chrissy?
Yeah, thanks, Lane. Thanks, Emily, for having us today. Happy to come and talk to you all today about the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is present in northern Minnesota. Again, my name is Chrissy Shaw. I'm the Senior Forestry Manager for FFCP. My role in the program is to come and do presentations and talk about the program, as well as oversee the foresters in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and oversee the implementation of the program. And I will just throw it over to Ethan for a short intro about what he does with us.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ethan. I'm an outreach forester with FFCP. A lot of my work involves working alongside landowners, going out and visiting different forested properties and determining their eligibility for the FFCP program. Excited to be here today and looking forward to more time with this presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Ethan. All right, so we will dive right in here. So first, before we kind of dive into the program itself, I thought I would just go through this real big overview, because it's kind of nice to tie some of these concepts together and then move into the program itself. So first, we'll talk about the carbon cycle, natural climate solutions, carbon markets, and then carbon program language. So we'll just back up here and we'll start big, but we'll talk about the carbon cycle here. So this is the global carbon cycle, and when we talk about how carbon moves or is stored, we're generally talking about pools. And here we have a diagram of the global carbon cycle, and you can see in this diagram we have circles that represent the relative size of each carbon pool. You'll notice that the ocean pool actually stores the most carbon out of any pool, which would make sense since roughly 70% of the Earth is covered by oceans. But also on the slide, you can see that we have arrows that indicate the flow of carbon between the pools. And the gray arrows on the slide represent natural processes that happen in the global carbon cycle. And those bolded arrows represent the human influence on the global carbon cycle. So the geologic pool, which represents everything pertaining to carbon locked away inside the Earth, and the biogenic pool, which represents everything green and growing above the ground, are the two carbon pools that humans have changed to cause an increase in atmospheric carbon. So why does more carbon in the atmosphere matter? We do know that carbon, when it's released into the atmosphere, has this affinity to form carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is one of the main greenhouse gases that's released during the burning of fossil fuels. So when we look back in time through ice cores and tree rings, We can model carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and the associated temperatures on Earth. And science has established that direct link between those two things. When we increase carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmospheric pool, we're increasing our climate. So that's really the way that we've established carbon dioxide as a main contributor to a warming climate. Carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere adds to the greenhouse effect that you see on this slide. And the green dots represent greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And these do exist naturally. We rely on them to trap some of the solar radiation that comes from the sun. If we didn't have an atmosphere with greenhouse gases, our planet would be cold and unlivable. But the issue here is that humans have increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by way of land use changes and the burning of fossil fuels. And so what that means is more heat is being trapped in our atmosphere and our climate increases. An increasing climate affects other weather processes like wind events. Fairly recent example that you can draw upon is Hurricane Ian, which increased in intensity due to a warm ocean current. But specific to forests, scientists think with an increased climate, we could observe increased forest decomposition rates, altered tree growth rates, increased insect and disease outbreaks, increased likelihood of weather disturbance events, and then tree regeneration failure. So some pretty devastating consequences. So now that we kind of have that big overview of the global carbon cycle and why carbon dioxide matters, we'll take it down into the forest carbon cycle. So here we have the 6 forest carbon pools and the relative percent that they represent. And I'll talk briefly on the flow of carbon within the forest. So the forest carbon cycle starts with the sequestration and accumulation of atmospheric carbon due to tree growth. That's a very fancy way to say trees are photosynthesizing. But that accumulated carbon is then stored in one of the pools in this cycle. So we have above ground biomass, which are leaves, trunks, and limbs, below ground biomass, which are roots, deadwood on the forest floor, litter from fallen leaves and stems, and then forest soils, which help ground the system. And then as trees or parts of trees die, the carbon cycles through those different pools. And the time that carbon stays in each of the pools varies considerably. We can see anywhere from just months with leaf litter to millennium with soils. And so the cycle then continues as carbon flows out of the forest carbon pool and returns to the atmosphere through several processes, including respiration, combustion, or decomposition. But carbon can also leave the forest ecosystem through timber harvests, by which it enters the product pool. And the time that carbon stays in the harvested wood products pool also varies considerably depending on the product. But it can take several decades or more to return as carbon dioxide. So I hope what this does is this helps outline, that our natural ecosystems really do this incredible job, which is they help us absorb some of this excess carbon dioxide that humans have created in the global carbon cycle. And so the influence that humans can have on that above ground forest carbon pool is really at the heart of the FFCP program. So why do we need programs like FFCP? So in this slide, what you can see is that if we, I think I might have dropped a slide here. So we'll move on to this one here. So really, the slide before, it was kind of talking about, if we continue down this trajectory that we're currently on of emitting excess carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, basically we're going to easily surpass what the Paris Climate Agreement goal was, which was to limit global temperature increase to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. So with that, you know, there is an opportunity and a role that forests can play as these natural climate solutions. And on this slide, what you can see is that the top 3 natural climate solutions are reforestation, natural forest management, and avoided land conversion. So when thinking about a carbon program, we can take various different approaches to, you know, how we're going to implement and tackle the natural climate solution realm. And our program, FFCP, looks at the natural forest management realm. Oh, there we go. Okay, I think it just got mixed up there. So this was the slide where it was talking about, you know, our business as usual emissions trajectory. So, you know, thinking about these natural climate solutions and the role they can play, you know, how do we start connecting those dots where we have a forest that's capable of providing us some of that natural climate solution and doing some of that work of absorbing that excess carbon dioxide. Really how everything connects is through the carbon markets. So carbon markets connect the businesses that are interested in natural climate solution mitigation for their emissions. And this is a very simplified illustration of how carbon markets work. But in this example, business A has exceeded its regulatory or voluntary limit on emissions, and business B is below their limit. So business A can either go to the voluntary market to purchase credits or go to business B through the regulatory market to buy their extra allowances. So a carbon market is created when business A, business B, and a working forest become linked through the trading or selling of carbon. So now I'll dive deeper into carbon markets themselves, because there's a lot of different terms thrown out there that I think can confuse folks. And this slide really kind of helps me visualize what everybody's role is in this carbon market realm. So, you know, and I like to think of them as a hierarchy. So up at the top, we have the carbon markets themselves. These are the virtual exchanges where carbon offsets are bought and sold. Some markets may be required by law, and we call them regulatory or compliance markets, where states deem carbon markets are necessary. So an example of that type of market is the Cap and Trade program in California and the Climate Action Program in Oregon. On the flip side, the market can be voluntary, which is where a business or organization would come to purchase offsets voluntarily based on their climate pledges that they have made. Voluntary markets tend to see more innovation within them, in part because there is greater flexibility. They're not regulated by law. The price for carbon offsets varies between those two marketplaces, the compliance and the voluntary, and the compliance market tends to fetch a higher price for carbon offsets. So then within that carbon marketplace, there are carbon registries, and registries are the organizations that issue, transfer, and oversee the sale of carbon. And they're the ones that set the standards for acceptable methodology and how carbon can be estimated on the landscape. And they do hold their standards pretty strictly. The way you could think of registries is kind of like the stores that sell offsets. Each registry, like a store, has different products based on the standards set forth by the registry. And it's really up to the buyer to decide, based on those standards, which credits they want to purchase, since integrity of the credits and projects then can vary among the registries. The Family Forest Carbon Program generates verified carbon credits through Verra's verified carbon standard, which follows international rules for reduction in greenhouse gases. And then the last hierarchy we have in this slide is carbon project developers. And these are the private or nonprofit companies that help develop a carbon project and then monetize the offsets. So the Family Forest Carbon Program is a carbon project developer. So it's up to the project developers to work with their suppliers. And in our case specifically, we're talking about landowners who own forests to generate carbon additionality that we can then sell as credits on the registries. And just like the registries, project developers are also different in their approach to producing credits. Some project developers can take an afforestation or reforestation approach. Others can use that avoided land conversion approach by deferring timber harvests. And still others take the approach of creating improved forest management practices. And the Family Forest Carbon Program approaches carbon project development through the lens of improved forest management practices. So this slide here, I just thought we would cover some of the basic terms that folks talk about when we look at a program and methodology itself. So, you know, speaking carbon, very simply, methodology. So when I say that, what we're talking about is these are the rules on how we create a project, identify our baseline, and then it's really our job to make sure that our methodology is creating additionality, and then monitor that success and quantify the credits. So that is all rolled into what our methodology means when we say that term. Additionality. So, you know, this is what is the carbon benefit beyond what would have occurred normally. So additionality is what we quantify to form that carbon credit that we take to the voluntary marketplace. Leakage. So this is a concept where if our program causes a shift in emissions somewhere else, you know, did that activity get accounted for in our methodology? So the concept of leakage is really, if we create rules around our program where we say, you know, a landowner could never harvest essentially for, you know, like 20 years or however long your program is, and that harvesting behavior then shifts to another spot. So that is the concept of leakage. Permanence. So this is, you know, we want our carbon impact to have, you know, lasting effects throughout the years. And our registry defines permanence as a 100-year period. So really this is about, you know, is that carbon removal that we created in our program going to stick? And then lastly, verification. So these are the third-party reviewers, and for our program, again, you know, that's Verra. Submit that formal notice validating the project details, documentation, how we quantify additionality and generate our credits. And then they kind of oversee our monitoring plan as well. So that's our first segment. It's kind of a large one, so I don't know if you guys want to take a pause now just to maybe address questions that might have popped up.
Yeah, we can do that for this segment. That sounds great, Chrissy. So we had a question: don't humans also change the soil pool of carbon through practices like agriculture, etc.?
Yes. So that soil pool, when you think about it, you know, I had a couple slides over here where we were talking about the global carbon cycle and then the forest carbon cycle. So, you know, you could have scenarios where you once had a forest, and suddenly there is development for agriculture, or maybe houses or something like that. So that would be that concept of essentially deforestation. So that ultimately it really puts like a permanent end to this forest carbon cycle itself, by doing that. And so other programs, when they're thinking about it in terms of additionality, they can use that lens of we're avoiding forest conversion from one type to the next.
Great. Thanks, Chrissy. And I'm not seeing any other questions here, so.
Okay. All right. Well, we will move into then our next segment, where we're going to talk about FFCP itself. So we'll talk about the history of the program, and then our methodology that we use within our program to calculate additionality. So what is the Family Forest Carbon Program? So back in 2017, the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy took on the climate change challenge and formed a partnership. And from that partnership, the Family Forest Carbon Program, or FFCP, was formed. We first put down some roots in the Appalachian region of Pennsylvania back in 2020, and have since expanded to other regions, including ours. And right now, with the support from US businesses, NGOs, and federal agencies, FFCP is able to offer payments to woodland owners to implement climate-friendly forest management practices that will create additional carbon stored on the landscape. So you may be asking yourself, what is a climate-friendly forest management practice? So glad you asked. But in our region, luckily, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science has done a lot of research in this realm to help us out. And they created that regional climate adaptation workbook with specific forestry recommendations contained within it. So really, when we were forming the program here in the Midwest, we took that book and we said, how do we turn this into a workable, payable program that landowners can participate in to prepare their forests for climate change? And we molded it to a carbon program. So how does FFCP create additional carbon on the landscape? So, again, I've mentioned this before, but carbon project developers like FFCP can take various approaches to creating additional carbon within their methodology. And FFCP approaches additionality through the lens of improved forest management practices. We're kind of unique in the carbon program space in that we ask landowners to follow specific FFCP practices that have been developed by that AFF and TNC partnership. And so what the image on this slide is showing is an example of the modeled carbon gains of our FFCP practices. And what you can see is that the two stands, let me get out my little laser pointer so we can follow along here. But what you can see is that the two stands both start with the same forest conditions over here. And over time, the forest that's enrolled in FFCP following our practices will increase that above ground forest carbon pool when compared to a business as usual scenario. You'll notice on this graph that this is accomplished by harvesting either on a lighter or less intense basis. And that's really how we approach our practice development with TNC. So I hope what this illustrates is that, FFCP isn't a harvest deferral approach. We do allow landowners to harvest, and if they choose to do so, there are harvest guidelines in place that outline that less frequent, less intense harvest when compared to activity on the landscape. And those harvesting modifications have now been proven to create an additional climate benefit with the support of our most recent monitoring cohort over in the Central Haps. So, in short, what our program is aiming to do, and what we've always aimed to do, is provide landowners with that maximum flexibility and still provide that high integrity carbon credit that's generated. So another thing that our program did is we took a revolutionary step forward in the way that we are calculating carbon sequestered and stored for FFCP enrolled properties. And how we measure carbon gains is that we compare FFCP enrolled properties to 10 highly similar unenrolled properties through FIA data who are conducting that business as usual harvesting scenario. And really that methodology thought process was, inspired by medical trials where we have a control and we have a variable and we observe the differences through time. It's the same concept. So really what that methodology approach allows us to do is isolate FFCP as the variable that contributes to the additional carbon generated. And it also removes some of the challenges around projected or modeled baselines that come with traditional carbon programs who take that harvest deferral approach. And what that does is it provides us with a very credible claim of additionality, which results in those high integrity carbon credits that are sold under Verra's verified carbon standard. So verification under international standards that the Verra registry abides by was also a critical component to being that creditable program that FFCP wanted to be, to ensure that we're producing that true climate benefit. And we did get approval of our methodology by Verra back in the fall of 2022, and that was a milestone because if you think about where we started back in 2017. So this was a lot of effort gone into getting this methodology approved. So something else, the methodology is the first in Verra's dynamic benchmarking or performance benchmarking category, which basically means, you don't know what your control is going to do until you measure it. What this does is it makes our carbon gains more realistic and corrected in real time. So, for example, if we have a situation where the aspen market in Minnesota tanks and nobody is harvesting for 10 years, we will see that in our baseline, and the program would see moderated carbon gains, if any at all, during that period with our landowners. And what that gives our program is the high confidence that the additional carbon that we're calculating is attributed to our program, and it's real and it's actual. So I mentioned this before, but we're not accounting for carbon gains through theoretical models. In our program, we account for carbon gains by way of randomly selecting enrolled properties for monitoring. And then after that, what happens is foresters come out and visit the landowner who owns the enrolled property and collects that inventory data that allows for the matching comparison to properties that aren't enrolled in FFCP through FIA data. So when calculating carbon gains made by the program, we pool or aggregate them, which allows us to keep costs pretty low by spreading them out across all of our enrolled properties. And again, if we continue to see that business as usual harvesting trajectory, we'll see carbon gains measured that are very similar to what AFF and TNC modeled during practice development. So after that monitoring cycle is complete, we report our results to our registry Verra, and then Verra independently verifies those results that we're reporting. And that's all done with foresters who are going out there and taking those measurements. So along with the MRV accounting, our methodology also addresses leakage and permanence. And those two things are, important components of any carbon program. But we address leakage and 100-year permanence at the landscape level for the carbon that we've stored through contributions to a buffer pool and a permanence fund. So what that looks like for our business is that we don't actually sell every credit that we generate on our enrolled lands. We save a portion in those two pools to account for some of those things that we might see in the future. And that's all part of the intelligent program design that we have within our program. So that was kind of like the next segment, and maybe I'll do another pause here and see if we can answer any questions or have any dialogue.
Yes, we've got quite a few questions coming up. One said regarding the sorry, that jumped around. Regarding the baseline and comparison to similar properties who are conducting forest management, does this also include those non-industrial private forest landowners whose management is no harvest, or just those that are doing active management?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we are doing our matching, there are certain criteria, but it always has to be privately owned lands within FIA data. So we are able to sort those landowners out from that larger pool. And then we have 14 different matching criteria when we go through, and it's, like slope, it's forest type, there's soils, it's basal area per acre, which is one of our requirements. And then it's really that whole matching criteria that we have is an effort to make sure that we're really at the same starting point with the landowners that we're following for monitoring and the ones that we're gonna, follow for that additionality claim. Yeah, good question.
Thanks. And this question has multiple parts. So if you could, Chris, if you could call up the Q&A section, it's Jeff Kroll's question. When
Okay.
it comes to soil carbon credits and agriculture activities, are all activities included, or how is the entire group of activities such as tilling, fertilizer production factored into the overall crediting? We'll start with that.
Yeah, so when we're thinking about forest soils, and maybe Jeff, this is we're thinking perhaps about two different realms here. So carbon programs can go in a lot of different directions, which is maybe the unfortunate part about being a practitioner in this day and age right now. But we do have landowners who can enroll in agriculture specific carbon programs. So Organic Valley down here in Southwest Wisconsin actually has a carbon program for its landowners that they can enroll. And it's very specific to a tilled field scenario. So that, that is essentially like what they're looking for to enroll. In our program, we're looking for, essentially intact forests to enroll. So it's kind of a different starting point. But, we do have within our methodology, places where we do address forest soils and the impacts that we do have within them. And again, it's kind of wrapped up into that larger big picture of, the forest carbon cycle that we're looking at here. So hopefully that answered your question, or maybe kind of parsed out what we're looking at specifically here, which is we're looking at intact forests and the activities that can happen within them. Was there anything, Jeff, you wanted to maybe clarify or follow up on?
Yeah, Jeff, if you'd like, you could just put another question in the Q&A or just type in chat here. But in the meantime, just to keep us rolling, there's so many good questions here. I know we won't be able to get through all of them. How do you define business as usual and additionality in Minnesota? I've found that many family forest owners harvest less than public and industry lands.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the business as usual is defined by our program by looking at privately owned lands in FIA data who are actively harvesting. So that is the baseline for the landowners in Minnesota. And since we do have more of a regional approach, since we're using an FIA data set, we're looking at not only landowners in Minnesota, but landowners in Wisconsin and landowners in Michigan. So, we kind of get lumped into essentially like a bigger eco region. But again, that FIA data set is really kind of about setting up exactly that, establishing those similar eco regions. So that's how we do that.
Great. And we'll do one more. It looks like some of the questions, like the minimum acreage necessary, you'll get to here in this next section.
Yep.
One final question at this stage. How do you account for carbon gains in carbon stored in long-lived wood products?
Yeah, so we do have, in our methodology, we do have harvested wood products within the methodology itself. But again, kind of thinking about that bigger picture, things can change, obviously. So, we had a picture and it might shift depending on what the trends are in the industry. And I know something that I have heard in the past, is about, the engineered wood products and how those are impacting essentially the carbon, cycle and the life cycle itself. So those are things that we are taking into account in our methodology, and our science team has actually been in touch with the Minnesota Forest Resource Council on their findings with that life cycle assessment that they're doing right now currently. So, it's not to say it won't change, but that picture that we had initially, harvested wood products account for about 5% of the whole carbon storage pool. It's largely due to either longevity of the product or that products end up in landfills after they're, no longer needed, or someone decides their house is not what they want it to be and they remodel and all of that stuff goes into the landfill, unfortunately. So, there's nuances to it, certainly. And we are continuing to learn and absorb, those things that are trending in the future. So yeah, good question, but it is incorporated.
Great. And actually, and sorry, one more question here. I'm reading through, kind of on that note, question from Kent: when timber harvest is delayed on a property that is enrolled, the mill just does not go with less wood. Wouldn't more wood come from other properties, and thus there'd be no net gain in carbon storage? So the leakage term that you described earlier.
Yeah, exactly. So that is the concept of leakage. So when thinking about, it's really kind of about that bigger picture of, this, we're all kind of in this together, essentially. And so programs that, simply defer harvesting for, X number of years, however long their contracts are, that has impacts on their methodology and what they're able to calculate and report. And we do have leakage contained within our program. And, again, it's about not selling every carbon credit that we generate in case we have those types of impacts with our program. But, we're kind of one of the unique ones where we do allow harvesting to an extent because we recognize that is part of our picture. It is part of our bigger picture of creating additionality, is that we do need and use wood products. So yeah, that's a great question, but leakage is included with our program. We just, we set that aside for what we're estimating our impact is with that leakage, essentially.
Great. And again, folks, you are able to also upvote questions with a little thumbs up button. So if there's one that you'd really like to answer, and push it up the Q&A section, that helps me as well. But we'll keep rolling here, and we'll try to get to some more questions here at the next segment or
Okay.
So
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Okay, so the next section that we'll dive into is program eligibility. So we have some basic program eligibility that landowners must meet. And then we have some region-specific eligibility requirements that landowners must meet. So those two things kind of, I guess, maybe like add to each other, so to speak. And then we'll talk about practice refinements. So if folks have been around our orbit and kind of watching what we've been doing over the past year, you may have noticed there have been a couple of changes, and we'll talk about those today. So first, we'll talk about the basic program eligibility. So, thinking about who is this program for? This program is for private non-industrial forests with a minimum of 30 contiguous forested acres that's within an FFCP service area. And again, our FFCP service area in Minnesota is the essentially northern half, where you guys have, you know, you're split between northern forests and southern forests, and we're present in the northern half for enrollment. These forests that we're looking to enroll have to originate from natural regeneration, so plantations are ineligible in our program. So thinking about the type of landowner that we are looking for, you know, obviously these people should be interested in contributing to long-term climate impact mitigation, but in addition, gaining other ecological benefits. What we offer to landowners is a 20-year contract. And one of the requirements for our program is, you know, we can't have land that has been enrolled in another forest carbon program, with the exception of NCX participants. So I'm not sure if you all kind of have the history of NCX, but they were essentially a 1-year program for these landowners. And after quite a bit of internal review to just ensure that we're not double counting those landowners in terms of their climate impact mitigation, our science team came back and said that we're able to enroll NCX participants. However, I have gotten some questions from folks about CCX, but unfortunately CCX at this point, we can't enroll those landowners. So the only exception that we're making in that realm is NCX at this time. And the last requirement for getting through for, you know, basic eligibility, we can't have any restrictions on timber harvesting activity. So this typically comes in the form of, you know, a potential conservation easement that could say something like, you know, this piece of land shall never be harvested in perpetuity. Those landowners in particular, we can't enroll because we will not be able to create additionality with them. They're already doing the best that they can, and they have a legal document in place saying that they're going to do that. So now we'll move on to the Midwest practice and our refinement efforts. So again, if you guys have kind of been around our orbit for a little bit, you would have been aware that we had 2 different practices in the region. We had growing mature forest practice, which is for the maple beech birch forest type. And then we also had a promoting diverse forest practice that was for the aspen birch forest type. So in the fall of 2023, kind of late fall, enrollment in that promoting diverse forest practice is on pause. And our science team that's comprised of TNC and AFF folks are currently looking at new data to improve our Midwest practices. And again, you know, this space is kind of new for us. We're in a new region. We're learning things as we get things off the ground here. But our ultimate goal is, you know, for continuous improvement in the program and to generate that high integrity carbon credit for the region. So we will dive in. So since our promoting diverse forest practice is on pause, what we have to offer landowners right now is the growing mature forest practice. And this is kind of like the overall, I guess you could call it like a theory or the goal of what growing mature forest is. So, you know, we're allowing these stands to mature and we're retaining our highest quality trees on these properties. So, you know, this is about extended rotations, essentially. We do put limitations on harvesting allowed to manage sustainably in these forests. And the whole goal, you know, we're hoping that after 20 years, we have more valuable timber and also improved habitat on the landscape. So this is now diving into, you know, our region specific eligibility. So for growing mature forests, along with all those basic eligibility requirements, we need to meet or exceed these requirements here. So the project area must have operable harvest conditions. That's the basics of the program. So in our region, we've defined that as 100 square feet of basal area per acre and a minimum of 5-inch DBH. For this practice in growing mature forests, we're looking for the maple beech birch forest type and at least 30 acres contained within that forest group type. In addition, this is new from the refinement team, but up to 25 acres of associated forest group types may be included with that 30 acres, as long as we see 30 acres of maple beech birch. So this could be aspen birch, this could be oak hickory, these could be anything that could support up to 130 square feet of basal area per acre. You know, the things that we don't want to see or that we don't want to enroll additionally with this maple beech birch forest type is forest types that might not be able to support, you know, what our optional harvesting guidelines are. Ultimately, we want a healthier forest for these landowners coming out on the back end. So again, you know, FFCP isn't harvest deferral, but we give these landowners the option to harvest. So I thought I would, and I've got a lot of questions from foresters over the time that I've been here, but I thought I would throw this one in here because I think perhaps it's not abundantly clear, but harvesting in our program is defined as removal of live trees greater than 5-inch DBH that's for sale, barter, or trade. So that's kind of the key if you're doing it for sale, barter, or trade. In order to harvest, the landowner's project area that we've, you know, defined and identified up here has to reach the minimum basal area per acre of 130 square feet. And then during the harvest, no more than 25% of the basal area can be removed. And then we can't have an average stand diameter reduction of more than 10%. And what that really does is prevents us from high grading out there. So this is a slide that kind of gets foresters thinking about, you know, the potential applications of this program out there on the ground. Again, noting that landowners are really tied to this. This is actually what is in their contract for their harvesting guidelines. So, you know, this picture could look different on the back end, but you know, this I just throw out here so that folks can start thinking about, you know, what this would look like in the forest types that they're looking at and, you know, how to apply it on the ground there. So, you know, you kind of have two different pathways essentially that, you know, landowners might be on that, you know, desire to harvest in our program. You might have someone who's on the uneven aged management track. You know, so we're looking at gaps of, you know, probably less than a half an acre in size, which would allow for single tree or group tree selection. And then during, you know, our timber sale, you would want to identify those poor quality, low vigor trees first, and then really kind of focus on expanding those natural canopy gaps that are out there on the ground to establish those mid tolerance. Another thing that, you know, you would want to consider as a forester, I'm sure you guys all know, but you know, really making an attempt to provide that natural fencing for deer so that we don't have heavy deer browse in these openings that we're creating for that regeneration. You may consider site prep activities if those are needed. So, you know, say you have a site that perhaps you're not happy about the regeneration or it's not adequate, you know, you can go in and scarify. That's not you know, that's not disallowed on the contract. Again, you know, the landowners are really tied to this right here. What's the language in their contract? And then, you know, you do have to reach that 130 square feet, but then once you do it, you can continue on. So, you know, the cycle kind of looks something similar to this over here on this side. You know, you've got your maple beech forest, maple beech birch forest as the starting point, 100 square feet. You grow it out to 130. You look at, you know, your regeneration options if you're at that point, and then, you know, you can keep moving through. The alternative is you can have a landowner who is interested in a program and wants to harvest that's on, an even age management track. So, our program harvesting guidelines does dovetail pretty nicely with thinnings. However, it should be noted that rotations do have to be timed with the conclusion of the 20-year contract, because again, this is what the landowners are bound to for the 20 years that they are with us in our program. So that was that segment. So maybe I'll do another pause and see if there is opportunity for questions.
Yes, there's no shortage of questions here. So we'll try to just get a couple here, acknowledging that we've got 9 minutes left in the webinar. How do you address spruce budworm outbreaks when it causes high mortality in spruce fir forests without management? Carbon declines. On the other hand, with speedy management intervention, a healthy young forest can be generated much sooner.
Yeah, so for spruce forests in particular, we do have some guidelines here that we have to follow for enrollment. So, first we want to see, we have to see Maple Beech Birch Forest with 30 contiguous acres, and the spruce fir forest can be the associated forest group type that's included within that larger enrollment area. However, if you're looking at, serious insect and disease issues such as that, I would not recommend enrolling that associated forest group type within our program. And really, I'm relying on a lot of you to be the experts out there on the ground as to what is appropriate to enroll in our program and what is not. So providing that advice to the landowner after, you reach this eligibility bar, and letting them know, hey, this is about keeping your forest healthy, and, enrolling in this program is not exactly going to, provide you the benefits that you're looking for, nor your community, where it could become a fire hazard or something like that. So, yeah, that's a great question and a good point of clarification. So, spruce fir could be that associated forest group type, but if you're seeing those types of things out there on the landscape, I would not recommend enrolling that as an associated forest group type in our program.
And building off of that, another question: are oak cover types in Minnesota allowed for credits if Maple Beech Birch is not available, given the generally low acreages of that specific forest type?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So our refinement team is currently re-examining oak hickory, which may have implications in the future. But right now, what we can do for oak hickory is that we do have to, we first have to have that starting line where we see 30 acres of Maple Beech Birch. And I do recognize in Minnesota that forest type is, relatively uncommon. So hopefully with the refinements that we're going through right now, we will have some more opportunity for other forest group types like oak hickory in the future. But right now, what we can do is it can be included in that project with the Maple Beech Birch. So yeah, good question.
And then quickly, one last one, because we're down to 6 minutes left. I appreciate you
Yep.
answering these as we go. Could you explain the reason for not including planted trees? And I interpreted that as not including plantations.
Yes.
And was the distinction then being able to include, as you said, the natural regeneration, that includes artificial regeneration as long as it wasn't historically a plantation? Or...
Yes, so the way that we define plantations within the program is a forested area that is at least 50% planted stock. And the reason we didn't include that is simply because FIA data just didn't have a really great way for us to separate out, what is actually happening in those plantations, recognizing that we tend to plant them at a much higher density in order to come back and manage them on kind of a very regular schedule. And the opportunities for us to essentially come in and create additionality in that process might compromise the health of those stands that are growing kind of on that schedule. So that was the reason why plantations aren't considered for the program. Yeah, good question.
So there's more questions, but let's just keep rolling here just to keep us on track here. Thank you.
Yep, and I think, since we've only got like 4 minutes left, this segment right here is kind of long. So maybe what I'll do, Lane, if that's all right, I will put a pin in this segment and jump to the last one. And then I'm more than happy to come back and return and continue this conversation with, the landowner benefits and commitments and, how they get into the program, if that's all right.
That sounds great, Chrissy. And real quick for our participants, look in the chat shortly for a link to get continuing ed credits. This is worth 1 CE or SAFC FE. So thanks, Chrissy.
Yep. Yeah. So then I just thought, since I'm in front of an audience of, professional foresters right here, I thought I would talk about what the role you all can play in the program. I work with the foresters in the region that are doing eligibility and project planning. So I thought I would take a minute to speak to that. So within our program, we have a lot of different roles that foresters can play. For me specifically, I am part of the pre-enrollment FFCP team. So I have an agreement that I can offer to foresters, which allows them to basically set up projects for us with landowners. So when you sign our agreement, we're asking you all to take a look at these landowners for eligibility and then submit project planning in the CRM database. However, there's a lot of other touch points in our program for foresters to interact with us. Other ways, these landowners who do enroll with us are required to get a forest management plan for their entire forested acreage, which we provide them a stipend to procure forester services to go and do that. So you might have landowners that come to you and say, I have an FFCP contract. I need a management plan written now. So you might encounter landowners that way and interact with our program that way. Another way is if landowners choose to harvest in our program, they do have to procure forester services to do pre and post harvest data collection. So those folks that are actively managed and looking at actively managing their forests moving forward may come to you and say, I'm in this program. Can you do this data collection for me and set up my timber sale? There might be landowners out there that, need to take care of some invasive species and, really make their forest healthy again that are in our program. And again, as long as we're not in that harvesting realm of the contract, those types of things are allowed and they can go to you all to procure those services and complete those treatments. And the last way that you all can interact is through the monitoring. So we do look for consulting forester firms to collect that inventory data on FFCP enrolled properties that allows for the matching comparison to FIA data. So if you are a larger group interested in something like that, I can certainly help connect you all to the folks who do that. So again, for my purposes and my role, I'm looking at, pre-enrollment of the program and making sure the foresters, are applying the program out there on the ground correctly. But so, this is what we can offer the foresters who are interested in doing those services. And when you do sign up with us, you can choose to work with only your clients. So if you only want to just, stay with your client base and work with them, if they're interested in this program, that's perfectly fine. The other alternative is that, you can look at accepting new clients from us along with working with those existing clients that you might have for eligibility and project planning within the program. So with that, I will conclude and thank you, Lane, again for having me here. And if there's time for a couple of short questions, I realized we have a lot in the chat there. So
yes, quite a bit. But that was great, Chrissy. Thanks so much. And thanks to our audience for being so engaged. It's an embarrassment of riches to be able to have so many questions. Check out the chat for some important links, especially those CEs for those folks seeking it. A question from Amanda Keeper. I'm still trying to understand how the BAU was determined for calculating additionality. much of the non-industrial private forest landowner land in Minnesota is currently undermanaged, are you only comparing enrolled lands to those NIPF lands that FIA data shows have recent harvest activity? If so, how can you be sure enrollees ever planned to harvest before enrolling?
Yeah, so for that one, you know, the way that we did pull the BAU for the region was looking at those privately owned lands in FIA data. And we looked at the entire set. So it wasn't just those that are actively managing, it was everybody who was contained within that forest type. What did that harvesting behavior look like on the landscape? And so that is our BAU, and that is our baseline. So if we're thinking about moving forward with that, you know, we want to make sure in our program that we're creating that additional carbon stored. So, you know, I think we had kind of talked quite a bit about, you know, what the harvesting guidelines are within our program, but that really kind of speaks to what we saw in the BAU for FIA data. So, you know, a couple of key components were, you know, we have to have 100 square feet of basal area per acre. And then we do have to reach that 130 square feet per acre in the contract area in order to harvest. So, those two things are kind of speaking to where that baseline was in our region for harvesting. So hopefully that gives a better picture of what that is and how it was developed.
Great. Thanks, Chrissy. And so that there's still more questions. It's also a couple minutes after the hour. Since we won't be able to get to all the questions, are you comfortable with folks reaching out to you via email if they wanted to follow up on this, or is there a good contact point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'll go to the last slide here and I'll pop up my info, and I will just plop it right into the chat for folks. And apologies here, I'll just escape out of the presentation and then copy and paste that for folks. Okay, and hopefully that popped up for everybody in the chat.
Oh, that's just hosts and panelists.
Okay.
If you want to just resend it to everyone.
Yeah, I'm not seeing in everyone. Lane, are you able to
no
share?
sweat. I can just
Okay.
I'll copy and paste that.
Thank you. I just didn't see that. Awesome.
Perfect. But again,
Okay.
thanks folks for attending today. And there's so many questions. We're hoping to have Chrissy at the research review coming up, but in either case, this isn't the last that we've heard from Chrissy. I suspect we're hoping to collaborate going forward. So stay tuned for that. We also have a carbon centric webinar coming up in September, and more details will be coming for that webinar closer to that date. Thanks so much, Chrissy and Ethan, for presenting today, and thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you all. Appreciate it.